When we think of teenagers today, it's often about smartphones, TikTok, dances, hoodies, sneakers, and endless scrolling on social media. But back in the 1970s and 1980s, being a teenager looked completely different. There were no cell phones, no internet, and no online shopping. Life was slower, freer, and more faced. If you were a teen in those decades, you lived in a world full of mixtapes, vinyl records, payphones, mall hangouts, neon colors, disco balls, and cassette tapes. Let's travel back in time and really explore what teenagers looked like, how they dressed, how they acted, and what made those decades unforgettable. Teenagers in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, teens were still riding the wave of the 1960s counterculture. Bell-bottom jeans, tie-dye shirts, and peace signs were everywhere. Long hair wasn't tea, just to style it was a statement. Boys let their hair grow long and shaggy, while girls often wore natural, middle-parted hair. Makeup was minimal compared to today. Most girls preferred a natural look with just a bit of eyeliner or lip gloss. The idea was free spirit, free mind. Music defined teenagers. If you were a teen in the 70s, you probably had a stack of vinyl records leaning against your bedroom wall. Rock and roll wasn't just music, it was identity. Bands like Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, and the Rolling Stones filled bedrooms with sound, while disco fever lit up the dance floors. Teens in the late 70s wore glittery shirts, wide collars, and platform shoes, trying to capture the glamour of disco clubs. Social life meant real, physical hangout. Teens didn't text each other. They rode their bikes across town to knock on a friend's door. Malls weren't yet the giant teen hubs they became in the 80s, but roller rinks and drive-in theaters were popular. A Friday night might mean piling into someone's car, driving to the local burger joint, and blasting the radio until midnight. School life also shaped teenage identity. High schools in the 70s were filled with denim jackets covered in patches, backpacks full of spiral notebooks, and maybe a secret stash of notes passed under desks. Teachers didn't have PowerPoints or smartboards, just chalk and blackboards. Teenagers weren't glued to screens, so they doodled in their notebooks, whispered in hallways, and lived in the moment. Teenagers in the 1980s. Now, let's step into the 1980s, the decade of excess, bold fashion, and MTV. If the 70s were about earthy, free-flowing vibes, the 80s were about standing out and making a statement. Everything was bigger, brighter, and louder. Fashion exploded with neon colors, leg warmers, leather jackets, and big hair. Teens carried boom boxers on their shoulders, blasted cassette tapes, and lived for MTV music videos. Madonna, Michael Jackson, Prince, and Duran Duran weren't just artists, they were style icons. Teenagers copied their looks, from fingerless gloves to parachute pants. For girls, hair was teased high with hairspray, bangs curled, and scrunchies wrapped around ponytails. Makeup was bold blue eyeshadow, bright blush, glossy lips. Boys rocked mullets, ripped jeans, and graphic band tees. Skate culture also began to rise, and skaters in Vans, sneakers, and baggy jeans carved out their own identity. By the mid-80s, malls became the ultimate teenage hangout. Shopping wasn't just about being it, was about being seen. Teens walked in groups, carried cassette players, and tried on clothes at stores like The Gap or Guess. Food courts buzzed with chatter while arcades filled with kids playing Pac-Man and Space Invaders. School dances in the 80s looked like scenes from a John Hughes movie. Slow dancing under disco balls, wearing pastel dresses and tuxedos with bow ties. Proms became a rite of passage where every detail mattered. The corsage, the limo, the photo backdrop. Movies also shaped teen culture. Films like The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and Footloose reflected the teenage experience. They showed cliques, rebellion, friendship, and the struggle of figuring out identity. Every teen could find a character to relate to. Technology was slowly changing things too. Instead of smartphones, teens had landline phones with long, curly cords. If you liked someone, you had to call their house and risk their parents picking up first. If the line was busy, you just had to wait. Personal computers were starting to appear, but most teens still spent their time outside at arcades or glued to the TV watching MTV Top 20 Video Countdown, comparing the 70s and 80s teenagers. So what did teens really look like back then? The 70s teens were laid back, earthy, and experimental. They dressed in denim, suede, and fringe. They connected through music, protests, and community hangouts. The 80s teens, on the other hand, were bold, flashy, and all about self-expression. Their style screamed individuality, and their world revolved around mall culture, TV, and pop icons. But both decades had something in common: face-to-face connection. Unlike today, there was no social media to hide behind. Teenagers laughed together, fought together, and experienced life in person. They weren't worried about filters or Instagram likes. They were worried about whether their cassette tape would get eaten by the tape player or if their favorite record would skip at the wrong moment. Why this era still matters. Looking back, it's clear that the 70s and 80s shaped modern teenage culture in huge ways. The music, the movies, the fashion, all of it left a lasting impression. Today, teenagers are rediscovering retro styles. Vinyl records are making a comeback, and 80s-inspired fashion is back on runways. Nostalgia is powerful because it reminds us of a simpler, freer time. If you grew up in the 70s or 80s, you know that your teenage years were defined by mixtapes, handwritten notes, Polaroid cameras, and hanging out until the street lights came on. For today's teens, it might sound like a completely different world, but that's what makes it so special. Closing. So that's what teenagers really looked like in the 70s and 80s. Their hair, their clothes, their music, their social lives, all of it was unique, colorful, and unforgettable. Whether it was roller rinks and disco in the 70s, or malls and MTV in the 80s, being a teenager back then was an adventure in itself. Maybe today's teens can't fully understand it, but for those who lived it, it's a chapter of life that will never be forgotten.